what can business do under COVID-19? So we can't define the role of business under these circumstances as maximizing shareholder value. It would be totally inappropriate.
It's great to be back with the Better Business series, and today on the show we welcome Bonang Mohale. Bonang is an acclaimed businessman, author and academic, currently serving, and wait for it, as Chancellor at the University of the Free State, Professor of Practice at the Johannesburg Business School, Chairman of the Bidvest Group Limited, and author of the acclaimed book Lift As You Rise. I'm really excited for the conversation ahead, and I'm most inspired by the energy, enthusiasm and humanity that Bonang brings to his leadership. Thank you so much for joining us, and we are really looking forward to this conversation.
Tom, thank you for having me.
Now tell me, Bonang, having looked at your career, your sequence of leadership roles in enviable positions, many people might look at that track record and think it was easy for you, but we know that that may not have been the case. Tell us about your early years, especially in business, and whether you thought that you could achieve what you have today when you set out.
So, of course, these things are much easier in hindsight. You do the work, and then after, you try and find words to describe it. It is fair to say I've been blessed with some amazing, wonderful, good opportunities. I set out initially as a typical township thug from Katlehong, born in Benoni, and wanted to be a medical doctor. And I spent probably 5 years at Wits Medical School. Professor Philip Tobias was our dean at that time. And I really thought that I was going to make a wonderful clinician, until one day I heard an African guy being interviewed on the radio, the late Maduke Lottenloof. And I said, wow, this guy is on point, he's articulate, he knows what he's talking about, and truly inspirational. And I said, you know what, I want to be a manager. Rather than sit in your surgery and see one patient at a time, managers sometimes talk to 10 people, if you're lucky, to 1,000 people. And I think that's when the seed was planted. So early on, straight out of medical school, I then spent 11 years in pharmaceuticals. First 5 years with Pfizer, an American multinational, starting with a P. And I started out as a professional sales representative. For the next role, I worked for a company called Merck Sharp and Dome. It's called Merck in the US of A. Outside of the States, it's called MSD. Or Merck Sharp and Dome, of course, instead of just Merck. And for those 5 plus 5 years, I worked for the same boss, Barry Scott. And at Merck, I was a product manager, a new business development manager. I started the export department from scratch. We sold nothing to Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Botswana, and Namibia. But of course, by the time I finished, we had ex-factory sales that were quite decent. So those 5 glorious years saw me really get into middle management at MSD until I was headhunted to be head of department at Sandoz Products by Dr. Lothar Erhardt, a member of his EXCO, and reporting directly to him. At that time, my portfolio, of course, was corporate affairs, but of course, looking after the function of marketing in general. This is where I think I got the most amazing opportunity to be one of 18 people in the world to be based in Basel, the confluence of Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. We lived there for 18 months. Our job was to develop a business case that will see the merger of 2 out of 3 Swiss pharmaceutical companies, Sandoz Products and Ciba-Geigy. We left Roche out, and needless to say that we created a new entity called Novo Artis. Today they are called Novartis, and my boss became the CEO of both entities. Today, this entity called Novartis is alive and well. I'm hoping that it will indeed survive COVID. Straight after that, I think I was then headhunted to be the managing director of the world's biggest and oldest elevator company, Otis. Otis at that time was one of 5 subsidiaries of United Technologies Corporation. Hartford, Connecticut, that's where they were located. Otis, we made lifts. Carrier, they made air conditioners. Sikorsky, they made helicopters. Pratt & Whitney, they made jet engines. And of course, Hamilton Sandstrand, they made environmental products. They made cabin for Apollo 11 and 13. They made toilets for the space shuttle. They made suits for the astronauts. So 3 of the 5 were really in aeronautics. Absolutely enjoyed it. This was the first time I became finally accountable for the results, not just of Otis South Africa, but Otis Africa. I was responsible for 33 of the then 53. We now have 55 African countries. First 3 years I reported to Paris, Bruno Grob, a Frenchman that looked, walked, and talked like a leader. The last 2 years, of course, I reported to Paris. Mario Abajo, very Spanish, my boss, and he was like a father figure to me. So 5 glorious years. I was part of what we called EMEA, Africa, Middle East, Europe, and Asia at that time, an area of the world that was rapidly developing. Today, I think is broadly referred to as the emerging market. I then left Otis to think that, I've learned quite a bit. Even if you don't know anything after spending more than 10 years at the highest policy and decision-making level, let me now go and make this contribution to my country. When I was headhunted by the then Minister of Public Enterprises, Minister Jeff Hadebe, to be the Executive Vice President at South African Airways, looking after 3 portfolios. Revenue management, that's about sending the right aircraft to the right destination with the right capacity, and of course, price it appropriately. Strategic alliances, today there's one world, and I think part of the Voyager group, they now have joined the Star Alliance. Those are 2 global alliances. We went about the most difficult way. We signed co-chair and commercial agreements with every single solitary one of our partners, only in those destinations that we flew. And of course, I looked after global sales. So all our sales functions were run from here in Kempton Park. We sold tickets to in fact, to Fort Lauderdale, to the rest of the continent. We used to fly at that time to Sydney and Perth, and of course we will then take a connecting flight to New Zealand, and New Zealand was 2 sleeps away. So I did my stint at SAA, headhunted to be the chief executive of marketing at Sanlam, which was the 2nd biggest financial services at that time. Today they're bigger than Old Mutual. Initially, I looked after the entire marketing function for 10 subsidiaries. I served on the board of 5 of those entities. I chaired 2. I was on the Sanlam Limited main board. Later on, I was asked to start a new department from scratch called Shared Services. All the background staff like HR, like marketing, that can really be centralized rather than each of the 10 subsidiaries having their own. We then created that, put it in one location, signed service levels agreement with the rest of the organizations, and made sure that they keep us on the straight and narrow. Lastly, we started our own entity called Drake and Skull. We brought integrated facilities management to South Africa. We bought a company called Drake and Skull in the UK. We could only afford 50% of it. We ran it for 3 years. After 3 years, we had made enough money to buy the 50% we don't already own. The group was then called Tsebo Outsourcing. There were 5 of us who started this. We took Nozala as our partners. We sold them a 22% stake for just less than 2 million. After 5 years, it ended up being 6 years, having met their covenants, they made 300 million. We got paid 19.7 times PE multiple after tax, 15 times EBIT multiple upon exit. I think one of my greatest accomplishments. I then left that because for a year, Shell was already asking me to come and be their group CEO and be their chairman for Shell Oil Products Africa. Again, I looked after, at that time, 34 African countries. I was part of their top leadership team. In fact, I was in the top 80 in 114 countries, 126,000 employees. Very satisfying indeed. Took an early retirement at age 55. The 86 CEOs at Business Leadership South Africa then asked me to come and be their CEO. I thought I'll do it for 12 months. Having found a worthy successor, I ended up doing it for 24 months. And I've left a capable human being. And now I'm on my second tranche of retirement. That, in brief, is my entire journey.
Wow, incredible. I think that sounds like the journey of 10 men. What an incredible story. And I love just listening between the lines there, how you kept referencing, who hired you as though they had an important role to play in your progression. What is that in leadership? And if you think of your own role in respect of who you hire and how you work with them, what's your philosophy around that? It sounds like that was an important part of your growth.
It was absolutely critical because nobody is born a managing director. You have to have somebody that believes in you, trusts you, that can counsel, coach, and hold you by the hand and say, it's okay, this thing is doable. Once you have done it for the 7th time, you realize that actually it wasn't as cumbersome as I thought it is. You see, leadership is how you feel called upon to lead. It requires only 3 things. Initially, some sort of a compelling vision. Even the Bible says, where there is no vision, the people perish. It presupposes followership, and people will only follow you if they think that on a composite basis, you are taking them to a place that is substantially better tomorrow than where they've been today. Secondly, it's about having courage. Courage to follow your own convictions, irrespective of consequences. Lastly, of course, it's about integrity. This is the one that is less sexy, and we don't talk often about it, because you have to do what you say you will do. It's when what you think, say, and do is one and the same thing that you have this thing that we call joy, that you are absolutely aligned, that indeed you are a wholesome human being. And leadership, once practiced, it's about ensuring that you start first with the who, then the what. It's about extending trust. It's about trying to catch your people doing the right thing, then palliating, highlighting, and celebrating that on top of the roof. But when you see them do something wrong, you call them into their office preferably, or your office as a second choice. You close the door and you chastise in private, because that's how you force people to really be absolutely honest about their own abilities and capabilities. Because all you are trying to do is to create an environment where everybody feels needed and wanted, where they are free to speak their mind, where they can come up with a fresh and indeed a new perspective, knowing that they have a right to make mistakes. And then you, out of love, from a good place of deep and profound care, then you help them to take corrective action. This thing that is called social justice. In fact, you meet the word justice for the first time, if you are biblically inclined, in Jeremiah 10, verse 24, when he has a conversation with his Lord, when he says, correct me, O Lord, when I'm wrong, but in justice, not in anger. Because if you do, you'll reduce me into nothing. So you can see that we were meant to make mistakes. We are imperfect by design. And this thing called leadership, it's about how you continuously polish the rough edges so that you get better today compared to yesterday. It's called a search for excellence, not for perfection, because perfection is an absolute standard. Once you are perfect, you can't get any better. But if you search for excellence, it is possible to leave a little bit of room to get better tomorrow compared to today. Thanks, Tom.
Do you think leadership today has become a wider premise? So going back to your self-knowledge, self-understanding, self-leadership into business leadership, do you think the requirements of leadership are wider today because of the situation we find ourselves in economically and socially than just leading an organization well? Is it more about being of a greater service?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, now leadership permeates every sphere and aspect of our lives. A bus driver can be a leader. A church elder is indeed a leader. A helper in your own home over the weekend, in their own community, in their stock fairs, they assume often some truly incredible leadership roles. So it's about how you liberate that potential. You see, not the main body of our constitution, but the preamble to our constitution starts by saying we the people, not the politicians. It then says, recognizing the past injustices. It then implores you and I to go and correct those past injustices. For what good reason? To do two things. Initially, it says we need to ensure that every single solitary one of the South Africans reach their potential, not their fullest potential, just their potential. Secondly, it says you and I must work very hard to ensure that we improve the quality of lives of the majority of our people, especially those that are less fortunate than ourselves. Therefore, leadership is seen and manifests best in public office, where you go there to serve, where you go there to be the other-centered rather than self-centered, where you sacrifice everything and indeed you pay the supreme price because you want to ensure that you are not only obsessed with having a big checkbook and a fat bank balance in Switzerland or some Isle of Man somewhere, but where you say, through my actions, can I make it possible that every single solitary one of the 59.3 million South Africans become healthier, more educated, much more exposed, much more fulfilled, happier, only because they know that they've got a roof over their children's head, that when they're sick, they can have access to good healthcare, that they can give them the best gift in life, which is an education that will allow them to transcend social classes, so that it is possible to be born in the informal settlement of Alexander, just 2 kilometers across the bridge from the richest square mile, which is called Sandton. And you are, after 23 years of studying, you then are able to afford a house in Branston, the leafy suburbs of Branston, not because you won a tender, but because you have earned it, you deserve it, and you have worked hard, and you have saved, and you can be the first one in your community of Enkandla, Emondlo, Enmutu, Langanyanga, Guguletu, in Cape Town, to be the first one to have your own title deed, to be the first one that lives in a house that does not belong to the municipality, but because it's bonded, and you're servicing that bond religiously every month. And you are the first one to own your own car, and you can drive them to the rural areas to go and see the elders, because children learn, especially sons, by looking at the back of the heads of their fathers. So you can see that leadership really permeates every single facet of our life. But also leadership, it's not only about where you can go into a place and pay money for which you get value and utility. But leadership you also see in nature. I've written a book called Lift as You Rise, because nature is a wonderful metaphor for business. Because everything that nature does never does for itself, but it does for others. Nature is the one that says, that's precisely why rivers don't drink their own water, trees don't eat their own fruit, and the sun doesn't shine because itself needs the vitamin D. The flowers don't smell like Fontainebleau because they themselves want to impress, but so that you can plug this rose and give it to somebody and therefore complement your life by being the other-centered, by always striving for a higher value. Because when you do things only for yourself, in English, we say you are selfish. When you do things for others, expecting something in return, we say you are unselfish. It's only when you do something for others, expecting nothing in return, that we say you are selfless. That is indeed the highest form. It's like what Professor Stephen R. Covey spoke to us in his second book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, after principle-centered leadership. And again, his first book is about leadership, to say you move from being dependent on somebody else and you don't like it. You graduate to being independent, where you can do things for yourself. But once you are independent, you realize very quickly that we are social animals in bone and marrow, and we really find meaning and purpose when we can relate, engage, interact, and interface with other human beings. Therefore, you start striving for interdependence to complete God's work, because those that are helping others are fulfilling and completing God's work, as Khalil Gibral so eloquently reminds us. So for me, I love this notion of leadership. It's because through it, that's where we fulfill ourselves, we become whole, we find real meaning and purpose. We are able to recreate ourselves, because in a company, when you succeed, you don't only have one MD. You can have 350 managing directors, presidents, and indeed CEOs. It's this notion that we refer to as energy and power. Power is the position that you have. You're called MD, and you instruct people, you say, you will do because I say so. But power, by definition, it's like a speedboat. It's limited in its radius and its range, because when you turn the throttle, the V8 engine roars and you feel almighty and powerful. The nose points up and you think you can drive into tomorrow. But 15 kilometers into the middle of the ocean, you run out of petrol, you'll come back pushing the speedboat. Whereas a sailboat, on the other hand, gives you a wonderful notion. It doesn't have the arrogance, the roar of a V8 engine. It's how you turn the sail to harness the force, the impetus of the wind that comes natural in nature. And by definition, it's infinite. If you harness it properly, if you turn the sail appropriately, you can circumnavigate the world, not once, but 7, 8 times, 27 times, because that energy is infinite. So when you can unleash that energy in your own organization, you have 350 CEOs, MDs, and indeed presidents. That's what you want. That's how you leave a long-lasting legacy. The one is almost immediate. It's called instantaneous gratification. The other one is about planting acorns to have the oak trees in 30 years, because this thing called a politician is about being concerned about the next election, whereas a statesman is about being concerned about the next generation. So leadership concerns itself with the next generation, with the heirloom, with the legacy, with laying the foundation one brick at a time. It's like throwing a pebble in the pond and you watch the ripple effect that can go forever, precisely and as a direct result of your own input. Thank you, Tom.
What is the role here of education into entrepreneurship? Because we've talked a lot about big business. We've talked a lot about SOEs. We haven't really talked a lot about entrepreneurs, independent people being creative, reimagining solutions to problems, and essentially building out a middle layer of the economy, which surely is where we need to be focusing as well if we're going to see all boats with the rising tide.
Exactly, especially because the majority of new jobs come from small and medium enterprises. I leave micro because that's survivalist. Even with our big counterparts, when you look at the percentage of new jobs created by SMEs, it's north of 50 percentage points. South Africa, less than 15%. So there's a lot that still needs to be done. And the reason why we are not finding traction in small and medium enterprises is because we've got a Ministry of Small Business Development, But the subsequent and successive ministers of small business development have been deployees. When we have Dr. Richard Maponya, Dr. Sam Mutswenyane, who have started businesses under the most trying and difficult circumstances. Habakuk Shikwan, a cane maker who went to Buputatswana because you couldn't own a manufacturing entity in South Africa because of the apartheid laws. These are not the people who are being asked to say, how do we engender a spirit of entrepreneurship? People whose job it is to wake up in the middle of the night with sweaty palms, trying to figure out how they're going to pay their people, how they're going to meet their covenants, how they're going to pay their rent. Those are entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurship can be led. It's not an innate quality. The people who make the best entrepreneurs are kids at 7 who used to stand on 2 crates, serving customers in their father's shops. The best entrepreneurs are the ones that saw their parents, how they had a trusting and a respectful relationship with money. And these are mostly your Jewish people, your Muslim people, Indian people in general, because they've been traders and shopkeepers. So how do we extend that knowledge, that culture of entrepreneurship, of risk-taking to the rest of the population when in South Africa you have to register with South African Revenue Service, CIPC. You need to make sure that you get tax clearance. You need to comply with broad-based Black economic empowerment. In fact, the cost of compliance before you start any business could be 300,000. And some people can start successful businesses that could be Apple's and Microsoft of the future with just 100,000. But here we've made compliance so onerous and so expensive that we are really not focusing on it. So I think the way we change our approach to small and medium enterprises and to entrepreneurship in general, and you see this in universities, the best universities in the world will probably be Harvard, will be Stanford, will be Instituto de Empresa, i.e. University in Madrid, Europe's #1 business school, will be University of British Columbia in Vancouver in Canada. Those are the Ivy League universities. They've figured it out that actually we don't need the executive director of a business school to be a PhD who has published 27 articles. We need somebody who knows business, who can help us to develop a curriculum that business needs, not in 2020, but in 2030. We need somebody who can bring their networks and their people skills and their interpersonal skills in kicking down the corporate doors at Standard Bank, at Investec and First Rand to say, please build us a library. No, give us money so that we can give every single solitary one of our students a laptop because now we need them to do remote learning because of the pandemic. So when you look at Harvard, 80 billion rand endowment, followed by Stanford at half that, 40 billion rand, because even their Senate, even the people who are on their council are majority business people. So until and unless we change the way we have imagined and purposed institutions of higher learning to really flex with what is required today. Nick Binadel is an academic, but who understands business. He's one of 2 people who are South Africans that I know who started the university from scratch. Teddy Blecher is another one. And Gibbs is in the top 5 universities in the continent. So you can see that it is indeed doable. But I think to conclude, Tom, what we need is a close, personal, intimate relationship, working hand in glove, as it were, amongst all the 4 social partners, government, labor, business, and civil society, towards the betterment of our own country, of our own education. When labor says we are not going to take a salary increase in 2021 because we want our garments to be internationally competitive, that's when we know that we have won. When the people who work in the farms, in the Eastern Cape, say, you know what, we are going to reduce our total input so that input costs are low because we are competing with wines that come from the old world, but also the new world, in Mexico, in France, in Paris. And we want to make sure that we produce the best wines in the world by being the lowest cost producer because we've got the lowest margin need. That's when we know that we have made progress. When business people say, we are not going to steal because we are not government. We are not going to bribe, cheat, and we are not going to enable state capture because we know better. Because what is required of government and in business is really just three things. Ethical leadership, even though it's tautologous, because leadership can't be anything else but ethical. Secondly, is this notion of absolute transparency, not relative. And then lastly, this notion of final accountability. There must be one person whose head will be on the line when things go well, that we palette, highlight, and celebrate. When they go wrong, we chop off their head. That's what accountability does. China practices that. China 2010, they were onto their 12th five-year plan. 60 years, driving only two things: energy security and personal security. Nothing else. We are 26 years into democracy. We have seen, I think, 9 plans. We had a plan called the Reconstruction Development RDP, which was best, not because it was complete, but because everybody signed up on it. 3 years into it, we changed it to growth, employment, and redistribution plan or strategy gear, because we wanted to focus more on macroeconomics. Thereafter, we had the Asgisa plan when Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka was the deputy president. Asgisa was never given time to find traction. And now we developed the new growth path, 2010. And we promised 4 things: that will re-industrialize this economy, that we are going to focus on beneficiation, on localization, and the creation of black industrialists. We have achieved neither. And then lastly, of course, the NDP 2030, which diagnosed our problems accurately and said these are the 9 things that you have to do to make sure that this economy is growing at 5.4% at the high end. But for 3 years, we did nothing to implement it. Even today, the president is not having critical, crucial, but nonetheless courageous conversations with every single solitary one of the 400 MPs to say, talk to me how you are delivering and enabling the delivery of the NDP 2030 as our overarching economic strategy. Now we have developed another strategy on top of NDP, even before 2030.
As you said, it's about execution, right? We keep planning, we're not executing. And I suppose that is the challenge that we keep being faced with, is in feeling the need to come up with a new plan every time, which I think would be better replaced with executing on a good plan with robust principles. But now we are approaching the end of our time. It's been a fascinating delve, particularly into the macroeconomics and public sector and fiscal stimulus world. We know those are huge levers to pull, but equally we know that the entrepreneurial sector has a huge role to play in not just creating employment, but also in changing the narrative of business to become more stakeholder-centric and to serve, a wider gambit of society. And I wanted to ask you a personal question to end us off. And that is that you are a man who's worn many titles. And I would like to know which one that you value and resonate with the most.
I think the best decision I've ever taken in my life is getting married to Susan, my original wife, at age 17. 24th of August, we celebrated our 39th wedding anniversary, and she hasn't traded me in for a younger, cleverer, wealthier, much more hardworking young man. She has still tolerated me. She still has kept me, and for that, I'm eternally grateful. There is nothing that I value more than her being by my side as we go through fire. She has borne me 2 divine daughters, Tepiso and Maneo. And when we're in pandemic, I was locked up with somebody I care deeply about, that I want to be with. I find it easy to talk to, that we have moments and memories to share. Because when fisher women can't go out to sea, they repair their nets. It gave us an opportunity to repair our own nets at a personal level in terms of our own relationship, key relationships, but also in terms of family, how we engage, interact, and interface with the broader family. And then lastly, but business, because both of us are business people, even though we think of ourselves as homemakers, first and foremost, and members of society, so that when the economy opens up, to say, what is it that we can do to make sure that we unleash this potential? Singapore only has about 7.6 million people, but they were able, once fired by Malaysia, because they are so poor, to bring themselves into the top 10 economy in the world. Because Lee Kuan Yew said, I'm not concerned about my own personal bank account. I want the bank accounts of, at that time, less than 1 million Singaporeans who have no natural resources to posit themselves and force themselves center stage into the world economic agenda. And they succeeded after only 40 years. Thank you.
Well, Bonang Mohale, thank you so much. A statesman in his own right, a leader, a servant leader at that, and a wonderful ally to all of us trying to change the narrative. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We're really grateful for the time and for your insight.
Thank you, Tom, my dear friend.